So here's my review on Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine, and I'm going to split it into two parts. The first being some just observations and bits of content from the book that I found really interesting, and then the second part, some responses to some of the prompt questions. So it's a book about trauma and how that is stored in our body in the end, and often that's a response of an incompleted process. So when our body goes into fight, flight, freeze responses, as a response to danger, we often store energy, and that process is not allowed to properly complete in its most natural way, and that it's a physiological process, even though there's a body-mind connection and there can be all sorts of emotions wrapped up in that. Actually, a lot of it is just physiological, and also that there can be huge amounts of energy locked in that response, especially the freeze response. He talks about trauma as a community concern, and that there are patterns that affect us individually and collectively. He talks about developmental trauma versus one-off shock trauma, and the complexity of developmental trauma over time being a much more difficult, traumatic constellation to deal with, far more so than just a one-off shock type trauma. And there's that example of the abducted children who all went on to develop long-term trauma and PTSD symptoms, with the exception of one boy who was actively engaged in trying to dig a tunnel, and that was because he stayed in movement and solution focused rather than in a freeze response. So interesting with that. Also that we're supposed to move and be in our bodies, and that by paying close attention to our felt sense, more than just at a superficial level, that we can actually come to a deeper understanding of how we store energy in our body, and ultimately that there's a process through which we can allow release of that suppressed energy, and that vast amount of energy can actually be gradually decompressed over time in order to transform trauma. He also talks about just how complex some of the patterns can be in terms of our physiological holding, so that they can have all sorts of different textural, physical, emotional qualities, and different patterns of how we hold tension. He talks about how the way out is physiological, but also that it's a renegotiating of that response rather than a replaying and sort of re-triggering. He talks about catharsis is not always super helpful and can actually be somewhat re-triggering, and the same true of just sort of talking about it. It can actually be a reinforcement rather than a release. In terms of that renegotiating, he gives the example of the little boy and the hospital procedures, and his using his bear to in that process for him incrementally developing a sense of power and resourcefulness, and then re-encountering his experience through that, and basically that renegotiation of feeling in the body. He talks about the symptoms of trauma, that sort of arousal, physical symptoms, so hyperarousal, being on the search for same causes, often to reenact the initial trauma. There can be hypervigilance, sort of sense of othering, constriction, disassociation, helplessness. And it was interesting when he was talking about a traumatized person's reality, that sometimes for them actually the threat can't be found, and sometimes a traumatized person might not even be able to see it. There was the example in the book of the woman who had been forcefully abducted, who thought it was all okay. And there can be long-term patterns for a traumatized person of chronic helplessness, traumatic coupling, continuing patterns of anxiety and other psychosomatic symptoms. One of the things that I kind of liked in that was sort of he gives this offer of having the courage to feel and actually allow it, and that's a pretty powerful option amongst it, and to actually find that inner resource. Some interesting examples about transforming social trauma, and a really beautiful example of those sort of African women sharing songs with babies across cultural boundaries to establish some community safety, joy, understanding. And he talks about creating circles of grace rather than circles of trauma, and I thought that was a really kind of nice offer. He talks about first aid for trauma and accidents, that actually if no medical treatment is required, that you can enter a process through which you can facilitate and allow the proper feeling of the feelings that the body should or could experience to bring its process to completion. So whether that's shaking, crying, allowing the emotions, but actually re-experiencing that. And he talks about the importance of support, and actually that very often it can't just be done alone. There needs to be that sort of safe other person to allow the process to come to completion. So kind of what came up for me is one of the prompt questions, and there's some big stuff in this book for me, because there's I realised just how much I still, even with doing a fair old bit of work with this, done TRE and somatic experiencing, that I'm still very often frozen and sometimes terrified to feel some pretty deep and powerful stuff, and it is complex, that some of it has deep roots, not just one-off stuff. It can be developmental, it can be energetic, it can be all sorts of different things, and it's a wonderful journey, but some realization on my part of just that there's still more, and also that I have a default, I guess, in terms of freezing. I know from experience that the sort of the catharsis type thing is not always hugely helpful. It's interesting in this book, he kind of alludes to it, but there's more information elsewhere about how to do it with sort of titration and pendulation, that idea of coming in and going out, of the depths of some of that energetic release, and coming back to a safe space. And I'd be interested to learn more of that. I know that's coming up in the course. What realizations or important points did I learn? I guess it reinforced that there is a purely physiological component to it, even if there's an emotional or other related content, that ultimately there's a discharge of energy, and actually it's physiological far more than it is emotional or reliving certain patterns. There's just a physiological response that needs to come to completion. It also made me realise, and I do know this anyway, but just the depth and complexity of that trauma response, and that most people have it to one degree or another, consciously, maybe for some very unconsciously. Personally, I'd like to integrate a better lived experience of kind of working through it into my life, and that means just better and freer movement, I think, ultimately for me. What was the most challenging aspect of the book, and why did I find it challenging? On the other hand, what inspired you? Well, it's challenging because I know some of this material firsthand, and it's still operating in me. There are times when I just don't want to be in my body, and I can very easily go into an overwhelm kind of thing. It's strange, but it's true. I was inspired by the possibilities in renegotiating the whole thing, from the little boy stories to the whole society stories and everything in between. It's Peter Levine's work is pretty powerful, and sort of big crossovers with some of the compassionate inquiry stuff and Gabor Mate's work too. What patterns or opportunities has it highlighted for you, and how might those contribute to your growth? Still work in progress, I guess. To keep working on it, to still meet that experience with compassion and presence for the whole of the human experience and how that shows up. I mean, that's certainly been a huge learning for me so far, and what I would like to continue to offer to myself and others, both for my own growth. I know too that trauma can have roots in other places. It's not always just physiological. There can definitely be energetic and other components to it, and I think it actually gets more subtle and deeper. But I think these processes are still helpful even in those spaces. How could this book inform my practice as a breath worker? How am I inspired to bring what I learned into sessions? Well, for me that'd be sensitivity in the end, compassion to that trauma response, how it affects people and how it can be allowed and resolved. I know some of this space through personal experience, and I think there's a wonderful thing about being able to help others navigate a similar path, but also to be aware of my own stuff too. In terms of bringing what I learned into sessions, I think I'd be maybe a bit more encouraging and certainly better informed to support others in those spaces, and also to continue to work on myself and to not get lost in the trauma cycle all the time. I have learned that what you focus on grows, and even the I am traumatized dialogue has been pretty toxic for me in recent years, not always helpful, and sometimes that's been reinforced even by very well-meaning people. And I'm interested to learn a lot more about titration and pendulation, how to really work with those edges in a most heartful and compassionate way, and to understand and continue to help with that work. So that's it, and I'm pretty sure I'm a bit over time, but anyway, that's my review. Thank you.